The case you're about to see is fictitious, but the procedure is authentic. The characters are played by actors, but the jury is selected from members of the general public. Today in the Crown Court, Mrs. Vera Barnes, also known as Madame Veda Bronski, is charged with dishonestly obtaining £17,500 by deception.
By Almighty God, the evidence I give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You are Detective Sergeant Cottrell of Fulchester CID.
Yes, sir.
On October 14th last year at Fulchester CID headquarters, did a Mr. Harold Penn make a complaint to you?
That's right, yes.
And as a result of that, what action did you take?
I made various inquiries, and on the 15th of October I went to number 17 Spruce Road, Fulchester, and spoke to the occupant, Mrs. Barnes.
Mrs. Barnes, the accused?
Yes, sir.
And what did you say to her?
May I look at my notebook, my lord? I made it up the same day.
I've no objection, my lord.
Very well.
I said to her, "It's about this money you got from Mrs. Penn." She replied, "It's only her son who's kicking up about that. It's nothing to do with him."
Yes. Whom did you understand her to mean by her son?
No, Mr. Penn, Harold Penn, son of Mrs. Elizabeth Penn.
Yes, go on.
She then said, "If the silly old bat wants to give me her money, that's her business. I've done nothing illegal."
And whom did you understand Mrs. Barnes to mean?
Yes, my client has instructed me to say that she wishes to be referred to by her professional name of Madame Bronski, if you have no objection, my lord.
If she's commonly known by that name, I've no objection, Mr. Percival.
No objection, my lord. Whom did you understand Madame Bronski to mean by the epithet silly old bat?
She was referring to Mrs. Penn.
If the silly old bat wants to give me her money, it's her business. Go on.
I asked her to accompany me to the police headquarters, which she did. I then put to her the facts of the case as I understood them. She made no reply. I then asked her to make a written statement. This she refused to do, although she did confirm that on September the 24th she received from Mrs. Elizabeth Penn a cheque for £17,500.
Members of the jury, you'll appreciate that Mrs. Madame Bronski was quite within her rights to refuse to make a statement. She was not obliged to say anything at that stage, and you're not to take her silence as implying guilt.
Thank you, my lord. I have no more questions.
This case then arose from a complaint made by Mr. Harold Penn, the son of Mrs. Elizabeth Penn, who gave the money to my client. Is that right?
That was the first we knew of it, yes.
And that complaint was made when, exactly?
October the 14th.
Oh, over 3 weeks after the money was paid. Well, didn't Mr. Penn originally come to you and complain within days of the money being paid to Madame Bronski?
Well, yes, but he didn't make a formal complaint on that occasion.
Why not?
Well, I advised him to consult a solicitor in the first instance.
Yes, but isn't it the duty of the police to investigate any allegation that a crime has taken place?
With respect, ma'am, we did investigate.
But not until Mr. Penn's second visit.
That's right.
Well, so let me ask you again, Sergeant, why did you not follow up Mr. Penn's complaint?
Because at that stage we didn't have any firm evidence against Madame Bronski.
So what made the difference on the second occasion?
Well, we had a statement from a private inquiry agent which tended to confirm Mr. Penn's complaint.
Yes, if Mr. Penn had not made it his business to dig up the dirt against my client, is it true to say that you would not have proceeded in this case?
I object, my lord. The question is both offensive and hypothetical.
I think you've made your point, Miss Gibson.
Yes, I have only one more question, my lord. Now, if Madame Bronski did indeed use the phrase silly old bat to describe Mrs. Penn, did she use it in tones of contempt or of affection?
I didn't make a note at the time of her tone of voice, ma'am, but as far as I remember, she was angry and emotional when she said it.
Yes, you see, I want to suggest to you that Mrs. Penn and my client were very close friends, and that if my client did indeed use this phrase, she used it in the way that you might call one of your colleagues silly old twit, for example, without meaning any harm. Do you see my point, Sergeant?
I don't call my colleagues silly old twits, ma'am.
No, I don't suppose you do. Thank you, my lord. I have no more questions.
Are you Harold Penn, and do you live at 51 Beach Road, Fulchester?
Yes.
Mr. Penn, will you tell us the sequence of events that led you to go to the police?
Well, I'd been worried about Mum's state of mind ever since my father died, which was September last year. She missed him a great deal, and I suppose with being alone in the house, she had a tendency to brood, you know. I was concerned about her. Anyway, April or May it'd be, she started going to this Madame Bronski, fortune-telling and so forth. I said to her at the time she shouldn't be taking it all so seriously, but she did get very involved with all the mumbo-jumbo.
Yes, yes, of course. Well, can we move on to, let's see, September the 25th? Did you, on the morning of that day, receive a telephone call from your bank manager, Mr. Phillip Weems?
That's right. I was amazed when he told me what Mum had done.
Yes, yes, well, we'll hear about that later from Mr. Weems himself. But after you received that telephone call, what did you do?
I went straight round to my mother's house and asked her about it. Actually, we had a bit of a row.
Yes, well, you don't need to tell us what you said to her. After you'd spoken to her, then what did you do?
Well, as soon as I got the truth out of her, I went straight to the police.
Yes. Detective Sergeant Cotterell has told us that he advised you to consult a solicitor. Is that right?
Yes, I arranged to see Mr. Saltman. He's always been very good in the past, and he put us onto this Mr. Winder.
Yes, Mr. Winder is an inquiry agent, my lord. He will be called. And, tell me, what were your instructions to Mr. Winder when you engaged his services?
I said I wanted to recover my mum's money, and was there anything he could do to help, really?
Thank you, Mr. Penn.
Mr. Penn, why were you so cross when your mother had given this money to Madame Bronski?
Well, that money was the best part of what my father left her when he died. He worked damn hard. Oh, excuse me. But he did. He worked hard all his life. He was a self-employed builder, and when he died, he left her this money, and she just turned round and gave it away.
Mr. Penn, you are, I believe, your mother's only child.
That's right.
And when she dies, the bulk of the estate will pass to you.
Oh, now, wait a minute. If you're making out that I'm worried about that, I resent it. I really do. The only reason I'm bothered about that money is because it belongs by rights to my mum, and she was conned out of it.
Is your mother a generous person?
Well, too generous for her own good. That's obvious. And she's always been open-handed. She gave a cleaning lady over £100 to pay off her rent arrears. That was supposed to be a loan, but she's not seen a penny of it back.
So she's a generous person. Is she also an impulsive person?
Well, not what I'd call impulsive. Not really. She's more of a worrier, my mum. She agitates about things. She needs someone to tell her what's what. I mean, when my father was alive, she relied on him to make all the decisions, and so when he died, she had to find someone else to tell her what to do, and unfortunately, she picked on this charlatan.
But Madame Bronski became her friend and confidant, closer even than members of her own family.
That's right. Sinister. It was very sinister.
Yes, so you allege, Mr. Penn. But your mother was left a comparatively wealthy woman, wasn't she? And she had a choice. I mean, she could have spent the money on herself, but that wouldn't really have been in character, would it? I mean, you've told us that what a generous and unselfish person she was. Or she could have allowed it to pass on her death to you and your wife, who don't particularly need it. I mean, you already have a very nice home and a good job. Or she could give it to someone who clearly meant more to her even than the surviving members of her own family, namely my client, Madame Bronski. Now that is what happened, is it not?
No. You're making it sound like a considered, sensible decision. It wasn't at all. She was conned out of it.
Yes, when you saw your mother after she wrote that cheque, did she seem to you to be in her right mind?
How do you mean?
Or was she sane, Mr. Penn?
Well, of course she was.
And did she regret signing the cheque?
Well, not at that time, no.
No, nevertheless, you went straight to the police, and when they couldn't or wouldn't help you, you sought out the services of a private detective. Now, what did you expect him to do for you?
Well, as I said, I left it up to him.
Thank you, Mr. Penn.
Mr. Weems, how long has your bank handled the financial affairs of the Penn family?
I'm sorry, sir. I do not possess that information.
Oh, let me put it another way. How long have you personally been involved with their financial affairs?
Before I answer that, can I say that it is not the same question you just put to me? It is, in fact, a completely different question.
Yes, I know that.
But by saying, if I'm quoting you correctly, let me put it another way, you were implying that it was substantially the same question, which it is not.
Yes, I realise that, Mr. Weems.
Very well. I personally have handled the affairs of the Penn family for 8 years, 3 months, and 11 days.
Thank you. Were you an executor of the late Mr. Penn's estate?
Do you refer to the late Mr. Arthur Penn of Grantley Road, Fulchester?
Yes.
I was.
And how much money did he leave to his widow?
£20,328 and 60 pence after tax.
You're very precise.
Thank you.
Do you also handle a bank account in the name of Mrs. Vera Barnes? accounts?
I handle 2 accounts in that name, a current account and a deposit account.
Thank you. Now then, can I ask you about last September the 25th? On that morning, did you have presented to you a cheque drawn on Mrs. Penn's account?
The cheque to which you refer was presented to a member of my staff, who asked me whether it would be in order to transfer the amount.
Presented by whom?
By Mrs. Barnes.
May the witness be shown Exhibit 1? Is that the cheque?
The amount, date, signature, account number and cheque number are the same.
So it's the same cheque.
Possibly.
When this cheque was shown to you, what did you do?
I first confirmed the status of Mrs. Penn's deposit account. The funds were sufficient to cover the cheque, but I was concerned that it would leave less than £500 in the account, so I telephoned Mrs. Penn.
Yes, well, don't tell us what you said.
I wasn't going to. It was a confidential discussion.
Fair enough. Did you talk to anyone else about the matter?
Yes, I was sufficiently concerned to ring Mr. Harold Penn and discuss it with him.
But the telephone conversations you mentioned were at your initiative. Did Mrs. Penn actually seek your advice at any stage?
Indeed, she did not. And such advice as I gave her, she chose to ignore.
Was it unusual for Mrs. Penn to make an important decision about money without asking your advice?
Most unusual. She had been accustomed to ask me about the most trivial matters. I remember one occasion she wanted to know what sort of lawnmower she should buy. I recommended an electric rotary at £43.90. Another time, she consulted me about her breakfasts.
Her breakfast?
She wanted to ask me, as her bank manager, whether I thought it extravagant to have bacon for breakfast every morning. I can modestly claim to have converted her to whole wheat toast. So you see, as a rule, she took my advice very seriously, but not on this occasion.
Thank you.
Does Mrs. Penn have any important debts?
To the best of my knowledge and ability, ma'am, she doesn't owe a single penny and never has. Nor indeed did her late husband. He was punctilious about such matters. I often remarked on his punctiliousness.
Is there such a word?
There is, my lord. I use it often to my staff.
Oh, we live and learn.
Since the disputed gift to my client, has Mrs. Penn managed to live without her income, as far as you know?
I can't give you detailed figures, but the amount of money deposited in the bank has remained approximately constant.
So her generosity to Madame Bronski has not bankrupted the lady?
That is not to say that it was financially advisable, but no.
I take it then that you advised Mrs. Penn against making this gift?
I queried its advisability.
But she chose not to take your advice?
Evidently.
Is Mr. Harold Penn also a client of your bank?
Oh, yes.
And is that why you were so eager to oppose this gift? Because he was expecting to inherit the money, and as his bank manager, you were looking after his interests?
No, that wasn't it. It's a travesty of my motives, I assure you. My concern was that Mrs. Penn should not hastily dispose of the bulk of her assets on a whim.
Now, why do you describe it as a whim?
I thought it an ill-considered and impulsive decision. I believe she already half regretted it when I spoke to her.
Yes, was she sane, Mr. Weems?
I'm not a doctor.
Did she seem to you to be sane?
Of course.
And was she determined, in spite of your advice, that the money should be paid?
I'm afraid so.
Thank you.
Silence in court.
Are you Elizabeth Jane Penn, and do you live at 9 Grantley Road, Fulchester?
Yes.
Do you know a woman called Vera Barnes, also known as Veda Bronski?
Madam Veda, yes.
Is she present in court?
Yes.
Would you point her out to us?
She's over there.
Point to her, please.
Are you afraid of her?
No, of course not. I'm only nervous about giving evidence.
You'll find it's quite painless. How did you first meet Madame Bronski?
Well, it was an advertisement, a card in a newsagent's window. It just said spiritual counsellor and a telephone number, so I made a note of it. And I telephoned her, and she said I should go round to see her.
Yes. Why did you answer this particular advertisement? Were you in need of spiritual counselling?
Well, I didn't know at the time, but I realised after it was a matter of vibrations. The card projected an aura, if you understand.
Well, I don't understand, but no matter. This was only months after your husband died, wasn't it? What was your general mood during that period?
Well, I was very unhappy. Well, it was only natural, but of course mistaken.
Why mistaken?
Well, because that isn't what Arthur wanted. He wanted me to cheer up and be optimistic about the future, but I didn't realise that at the time.
I see. Tell us about your first meeting with Madame Bronski.
Well, it wasn't like anything I expected. I mean, I thought she'd be some sort of a gypsy, you know, with a spotted scarf on her head and earrings and a crystal. And I was quite surprised to find she was a very ordinary-looking woman with a pleasant house, nice furniture, and really someone you wouldn't look at twice, except for her eyes. Have you noticed her eyes? No, it's strange. When she looks at you, you feel sort of peaceful but tingly. It's hard to describe. Well, anyway, I went to her house, sat down, had a cup of tea, and then she told me that she charged £5 an hour, which I thought was quite reasonable. So I gave her the money.
You paid her before the session began?
Well, yes. Why ever not?
Well, it's very trusting of you. Go on.
Well, we chatted for a bit, and then she began to tell me things about myself I found quite amazing.
What sort of things?
Well, private things, personal matters.
Yes, well, we don't want to pry, Mrs. Penn, but did she tell you anything which seemed to offer conclusive proof of second sight or mind reading?
Oh, many things, many things. Oh, yes. Oh, she seemed to understand my personality completely, as though we were old friends. Yeah, yes, and she told me that I'd been very ill as a girl with glandular fever, that sort of thing.
Yes, well, very convincing, no doubt. What else took place during that visit?
Well, she found Arthur for me.
Arthur?
My late husband.
Oh, she found, but in what sense did she find Arthur?
Well, she went into a trance, and when she woke up, she said he was definitely in the second sphere.
The second sphere?
Yes, you see, when a person dies, they pass through these various spheres. If they're a ghost, then they haunt the place, you see. If they're earthbound, the place that they knew in life. But if they move onwards, then they pass through these various spheres, and she told me that Arthur had got to the second one.
The second one? Was this what Madame Bronski told you?
Yes. And she found it for me by astral projection.
Astral projection?
Yes, in the trance, you see. She left her body and she searched through the lower spheres for me.
Well, presumably with so many people dying every day, these spheres are rather overpopulated. Wasn't it rather a coincidence that she should have come across your husband, especially as she didn't know him by sight?
Oh, it's not like wandering through town hoping you're going to bump into somebody. Oh, no, she was guided by the aura, by the vibrations.
Ah, yes, of course, the vibrations. And you believed all this? It didn't seem to you that it was a load of nonsense?
Are you a Christian, may I ask?
Well, I don't see what that's got to do with it, but yes.
Do you believe in the resurrection and the life everlasting?
Well, yes.
Well, why do you think it's nonsense, then, when we've given proof of these things?
Well, what proof did Madame Bronski give you that she'd spoken to your husband in the second sphere?
Oh, she didn't speak to him, not that session. He wasn't ready. Well, it's a great shock to a spirit, you know, being suddenly spoken to by somebody's astral projection when they're not expecting it. Oh, no, that's why you have an astral guide, a sort of go-between.
Well, you seem to know a lot about spiritualism. Is this information that you've had from Madame Bronski, or did you study the subject beforehand?
Well, I've studied it since I've been at Madame Bronski. Before then, of course, I was just an ordinary Church of England, but there's a lot of spiritualism in that as well, you know.
Yes, well, I don't want to debate theology with you. Can we move on, Mrs. Penn, to the night of the 24th? Did you on that night give Madame Bronski a cheque for £17,500?
Yes, I did, unfortunately.
Why did you give her that money? Did she ask for it?
No, she agreed to take it. I mean, she offered to accept it.
Well, perhaps you'd better tell us from the beginning what happened that night.
Well, you see, I wanted to ask the Taro a question. I wanted to be able to develop psychic power. Why couldn't I see through the third eye? Well, I thought if I could achieve that, then I could see Arthur again and even talk to him, and that's what I wanted to do more than anything else, you see. Well, we consulted the cards, and the meaning was quite clear. I was encumbered by my possessions, you see, by my material things. I was tied to the material plane by my wealth and my attachment to my home and my surroundings, and that's what the answer was, you see.
I see. Was this what the cards said, or what Madame Bronski told you the cards said?
Oh, well, both. Well, I could see the situation because she kept turning up these cards with coins on them. You know the tarot cards have coins on them, don't you? Well, she kept turning up these cards and tut-tutting and shaking her head, and finally, well, she explained what it meant.
I see. Well, what happened next?
Well, I was in a dilemma, you see, because I realised that my money was the root of the problem, and also that Arthur had given me this money so that I should be happy and comfortable in my old age and not worry. So I explained this to Madame, and we decided we'd ask Arthur what to do.
Yes. Did you suggest consulting your husband's spirit, or did she?
Well, both. I think we both thought it might be a good idea.
Yes. How did you go about it?
Well, we used a thing called a planchette.
May the witness be shown Exhibit 2? Is this the equipment that was used?
Yes, that's right. You put your fingers on the rim, you see, and the spirit works through and moves it about, and it writes its messages.
I see. So having got out this little device, what did Madame Bronski do with it? How did she proceed?
Well, she went into a trance. She closed her eyes and she muttered to herself, reciting her mantra. That's a special incantation. We all have our own mantras, but, well, it's supposed to be secret. Well, she muttered for a bit, and then she suddenly sat up straight, opened her eyes, and stared into the distance. And then the planchette began to move.
Did she say anything?
No, she just sat there very quietly, and the pencil started to make sort of meaningless squiggles, and then I said, "Are you there, Arthur?" And then the pencil gave a twitch and wrote his initials, AP. So I knew he was there, could hear me, so I started talking to him, you know, face to face. I said, "Now, look here, Arthur. I want to develop the psychic powers I know I have." I said, we all got psychic powers. You had them too in life, but you didn't realise it. I expect you realise it now, I said. And that's probably why you're only in the second sphere. But I said, I want to develop mine, but I've been encumbered by all that money you left me, I said. So what shall I do with it? And the pencil wrote and said, "Use it for good." So I said, "Well, what good?" I said, do I give it to charity, or do I send it off to famine relief, or what? And the answer was, "You will know." And then he drew a picture of a pyramid with an eye above it, a human eye, like a mystical sign. But it was a very firm drawing indeed. It almost tore the paper it was written on. And then, well, then the pencil made some more meaningless squiggles and then stopped, and then soon after that, Madame woke up.
So which of you suggested that the money be entrusted to Madame Bronski?
Well, she did, I suppose.
Yes. Did Madame Bronski discuss with you what she would do with this money?
Oh, yes. She said she wanted to buy a big house and open an institute, and then get serious students of the occult and people who had psychic powers to stay with her and study with her, you see. And I thought this was such a wonderful idea. She said it was her dream that I wrote her a cheque at once.
Was this a gift, a loan, investment, or what?
Oh, no, it was a gift. I didn't want it back. Oh, no, that was the whole idea. It was going to be my contribution.
Well, can we move on now to the events of the following morning?
Oh, well, then, Mr. Weems rang up. He said that I really ought to stop the cheque and think again. Well, we talked about it, and then I became really upset because I don't like arguments with people, and I knew that if I did stop the cheque, it'd annoy Madam, and if I didn't, well, then I'd upset Mr. Weems. Oh, and then my son came round, and we had rows, you know, and that was when I began to think that it really was more trouble than it was worth. So that evening, I went round to see Madam, and I explained to her the trouble I was in by giving her all this money, and how I'd upset the bank manager, had a row with my son, and I said, well, didn't she think really that perhaps I'd better take it back and think again? Well, then she became really very angry. She thought I was defying the spirits, that it was very dangerous to go against what the tarot and the spirit writing said, and that if I took the money back, it'd be the biggest mistake of my life. And, well, she said, she said terrible things. She said,
if you took the money back, what did she say would happen?
Well, she said I might die.
The case of the Queen against Barnes, alias Bronski, will be resumed tomorrow in the Crown Court. The case you're about to see is fictitious, but the procedure is authentic. The characters are played by actors, but the jury is selected from members of the public. This is Mrs. Vera Barnes, also known as Madame Veda Bronski, a clairvoyant and spiritualist. She's charged with dishonestly obtaining £17,500 by deception from Mrs. Elizabeth Penn, a widow. She's pleaded not guilty.
Mrs. Penn, how long did you spend at my client's home on the night that you gave her the money?
Well, I suppose I got there about 7 and left about midnight. Well, about 5 hours, I suppose.
And I gather from what you told my learned colleague that the main subject of discussion during those 5 hours was the subject of your comparative wealth and what use you should make of it.
Well, yeah, after Madam had read the cards for me and explained my problem.
And what was the problem?
Well, I couldn't develop my psychic powers, you see, because of my possessions, like money.
Well, did you believe that to be true?
Well, it seemed to make sense, yes.
Yeah, and do you think that Madame Bronski believed that to be true?
Yes, I think she believed it. But on thinking over things since, I do feel she twisted it round into saying that I ought to give her the money.
Yes, we'll come back to that. Do you accept that the strange symbol that appeared on the paper, the pyramid with the eye above it, was intended by your husband's spirit to represent the occult?
Oh, yes, I do, because I've seen symbols like that in books I've read since.
Yes,
yeah.
And do you accept that the significance of this drawing was, as Madame Bronski interpreted it, that you should give your money for the furtherance of the occult?
Well, could have meant that, I suppose, yeah.
Well, Madame Bronski said that she thought it meant that. Was she lying, do you suppose?
No, I don't think lying, but, she could be right. I mean, I expect she thought she was right.
Yes, fine. So, up to the point where you decided to give your money away to be used for the furtherance of the occult sciences, you have no evidence that Madame Bronski was acting under false pretenses.
No, but it was after that when she persuaded me to give the money to her.
Mrs. Penn, there's nothing illegal about giving another person money. The charge here is deception. Now, what was the deception?
Well, by saying she was going to get a big house and open an institute. It just wasn't true.
Oh, now, wait a minute. Look, your cheque was cleared on September the 29th, a little over 3 weeks later. Madame Bronski was the subject of a police investigation. Well, that doesn't give a person a very much time to exchange one house for another.
Well, I don't think she ever intended using it for that.
Yeah, but you've no evidence about that, have you? No, I suggest that what upset you was the fact that when you took it into your head to ask for the money back, Madame Bronski, as she had a perfect right to do, refused to give it back.
Well, I wouldn't have minded if she just said, no, you can't have it. It was a terrible thing she said, saying I defied the spirits, they were going to have their revenge on me and I might die.
Oh, now, just a minute. Do you think Madame Bronski was lying? Or do you think she really thought those things? Because so far you've told us that when Madame Bronski spoke about the occult, about the spirit world, you believed her every word. Why should you suddenly disbelieve her about this?
Well, I don't care if she believed it or whether she was making it up. She had no right to say those things to me. She knew it had upset me. I said, when I first went to her, I said, now, you're not going to say anything to upset me, are you? And she said, no, she wouldn't. It wouldn't be ethical.
Yeah, but, Mrs. Penn, supposing that she really believed that, supposing she really knew or believed that people who defy the spirits endanger their lives, wasn't it her duty as a friend to point this out to you?
Well, anyway, the way she said it, it sounded like a threat.
Well, it doesn't seem to have worried you unduly, or you wouldn't be here giving evidence.
It did worry me. I've not had a decent night's sleep since. I'm a bag of nerves. I've lost weight. I've been under the doctor for anxiety. It's been terrible.
Yes, I'm sorry about that, Mrs. Penn. But tell me, if you really wanted to forget the whole thing, why didn't you?
Because my son said I ought to try and get the money back. He told me to go ahead with it, and the police said that they could have her up for false pretences, which I thought was fair. Well, she did make false pretences. She wanted the money for herself, and she persuaded me to give it to her, and then she good as told me to go away. She didn't want to see me anymore. After I trusted her and thought she was my friend. Well, isn't that false pretences? Well, I think it was anyway.
Do you think that you were foolish to give away that money?
Yes, I do.
Mrs. Penn, if every fool who gave away their money ran to the police with allegations of fraud and false pretenses, they'd never have time to investigate anything else, now would they?
My lord, that remark really is unnecessarily offensive.
I certainly don't think it requires an answer.
No, thank you, my lord. I have no further questions.
You may stand down, Mrs. Penn.
Are you John Winder of 88B Exchange Buildings, Fulchester?
That's correct, yeah.
And are you a private inquiry agent?
That's correct, yes, sir.
On 1st of October last, did you undertake an investigation on behalf of a Mr. Harold Penn?
Yes, sir.
Who was the subject of this inquiry?
The defendant, Mrs. Barnes, alias Veda Bronski.
And how did you go about it, Mr. Winder?
Well, first of all, I ran a check on her as far as I could, without making myself known to the lady. Things like credit rating, criminal investigation.
Mr. Percival, I trust your witness is going to confine his evidence to matters touching directly upon this case and this case alone. Is that clear?
Quite clear, my lord. I wanted to bring in the defendant's credit rating as tending to show motive.
Oh, no doubt you'll have the opportunity to ask her about that directly, since whatever this witness might say on the subject must presumably be hearsay.
Right so, my lord. Did you then get in touch with Madame Bronski?
Yes, I telephoned the lady and said I'd seen her advertisement and I'd like to consult her. And I said I'd call on her the following Thursday evening. That would be the 9th of October.
Yes, go on.
Well, as soon as I got there, she asked for money. She wanted £10. So I gave her the money, and she did a bit of fortune-telling, palm reading and what have you. And then she said she thought I was under a lot of stress. So I represented to her, which was not the case, that my wife had died recently.
This was an invention on your part.
Oh, yes, I'm not married. I'm divorced, actually. My ex-wife is as fit as a fiddle. She's living with a butcher in Middlesbrough.
Yes, I see. Well, go on.
Well, she said that I wasn't to worry because my wife wasn't really dead. I thought, blimey, I've been rumbled already. So I was just going to own up when she said, oh, no, she's not really dead. She's just gone beyond. I said, beyond where? Or what? And she said, beyond the veil. I said, which veil's that then? And she said, the veil that we call death. To which I replied, oh. She said, do you want me to locate her for you? I said, yes, have a bash by all means, dear. So she put herself in a trance and started mumbling to herself. And a few minutes later, she opened her eyes and said, oh, dear. I said, what's the matter? She said, Mr. Williams, that was the name I was using, Williams. She says, Mr. Williams, your dear wife is earthbound. I said, oh, really? She said, yes. She said that an earthbound spirit is one who hasn't cottoned on to the fact that she's dead. So she said, if I liked, she'd ever go at contacting her spirit and letting her know she was dead, and then she'd be all right. I hope this is making itself clear to you, because it didn't make itself clear to me.
Well, never mind. Just tell us what happened next.
Well, she went on about earthbound spirits for a while, and then she said if I wanted the job doing, contacting my wife's spirit, you understand, she'd have to come to my home and stage the thing there. Apparently, that's where she was expecting to find my wife's ghost lurking about, sort of thing. I said it couldn't be done. I moved house. And I got a very funny landlady who wouldn't want seances or exorcisms on the premises. And there was no point, because my wife had never lived there in the first place. She said, where did I live at the time of her death? Because that's where the ghost was able to be, and we'd have to go there to find it. Well, I said the house had been demolished. But that wasn't true either. In fact, I haven't moved and I don't have a landlady. So she swallowed all this up, you see. And then she said, we'll have to go to the site where the house used to be. Well, I couldn't think of any reason not to go along with this. So we got in the car and I drove her down to Nelson Street, where they pulled down a lot of old houses and turned it into a corporation car park. Here we are, I said. This is where it used to be. She said, right. So she hopped out of the car and stood in the middle of the car park. People reversing all around her, honking their horns, flashing their lights. She said, I'm sorry, it's no good. I can't go into a trance with all these vehicles whizzing about. It's distracting, and besides, I might get run over. So she said we'd have to come back at 3 o'clock in the morning when the car park's empty. I said, presumably, this will cost extra. I mean, I wouldn't expect you to exercise a corporation car park in the early hours just for 10 quid. And she said, and I made an exact note of this immediately afterwards, she said, Mr. Williams, that's the name I was using, she said, Mr. Williams, your wife's happiness in the year after must be worth a lot to you. I said, I can't bear to think of her floating round Nelson Street for the rest of eternity. She said, well, in that case, I think you should have the full ceremony. It's expensive, but it's worth it. I said, what's involved? She said, there'd be a group of us, and we'd want to bring some people from London and some others from Scotland. You'd have to pay their expenses and make it worth their while. I asked how much. She said, £500. At that point, I said I'd think about it and let her know. Then she asked me for my address and telephone number. I gave her a fictional address and telephone number and went home.
Thank you, Mr. Winder.
What do you imagine your investigation If that's what you call it, what do you imagine it proves about my client?
It proves, first of all, she's a fraud. She's no more clairvoyant than I am. I told her a string of lies and she believed them.
Did Madame Bronski at any stage give any hint that she was not absolutely sincere in what she said to you?
Oh, no, she's very good. She almost had me believing it half the time.
So leaving aside the question of whether what she says may occasionally be mistaken, you have no evidence that she's a fraud in the sense that she deliberately invents things?
Well, she obviously didn't invent the bit about my wife being an earthbound spirit, did she?
Mr. Winder, we are all earthbound spirits.
Yes, well, you're right. Yes.
Did Mr. Penn suggest this trickery, that you should set a trap for my client?
Oh, no. Like I said, it was my own approach to the investigation. But he was quite satisfied with the report I gave him.
Now, about this money that was mentioned, the £500. Now, that was the cost of mounting a full-scale ceremony of exorcism or something of the kind, yes?
That's right.
Of transporting an unspecified number of experienced psychics or clairvoyants or spiritualists here, of accommodating them during their stay, and of sending them back home again, yes?
And that's if it wasn't all going into her back pocket.
Yes, but if there were, say, a dozen of these people for the sake of argument, wouldn't £500 seem to you to be a reasonable figure to achieve all this?
Oh, come on. You can get Hammond's Sourceworks band for that price.
Really? Nevertheless, that would work out at a little over £40 each. How much a day do you charge for your services, Mr. Winder?
Yes, I do a bit more, with respect, than clowning about in car parks.
Not in this case, you didn't.
Swear by Almighty God, the evidence I give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Madame Bronski,
I swear
let me
it
ask
also
you...
by the 12 lords of the flame of the magical city of Shambhala, and by my spirit guide, whose name I cannot speak.
Thank you. Madame Bronski,
I swear it by the spirit of Kut-Humi, greatest of the Magi's of Tibet, and by the gods of the Ancient Ones.
Excuse me, Madame Bronski. You've taken the oath on the Bible. Anything you have to add to it doesn't affect its binding nature, and can therefore be dispensed with.
I have finished.
I'm glad to hear it. Can we proceed?
You are Madame Veda Bronski?
I am.
And what is your address?
17 Spruce Road, Fulchester.
Madame Bronski, how long have you been aware that you possessed psychic powers?
Let me see. About 3,000 years.
Madam, if you're going to be facetious, I must warn you that you'll be in contempt of court.
Oh, my lord, I have sworn to speak the truth, and I so speak it, as the lords of the flame are my witnesses.
Perhaps you would explain.
Well, in all my previous lives, I've been a seer, a priestess. In ancient Egypt, I was a votary of Osiris. In Ephesus, I sacrificed at the temple of Diana.
Yes, could we perhaps confine ourselves to your present incarnation?
Oh, in this incarnation, I've been aware for about 25 years.
And what is the nature of the psychic powers that you possess?
I have the gift of second sight. I have the power of traveling on the astral plane. I have knowledge of the past and of the future. I have the gift of healing by touch and by the projection of my psychic energy field. I can see auras and read the karma of people, cats, and to some extent horses. I have other powers of which I'm not permitted to speak.
Thank goodness for that. Can we move on to the facts of the case, Miss Gibson?
Yes, my lord, I want to establish one point before I come on to my client's relationship with Mrs. Penn. I will be brief. How much do you earn by your clairvoyance?
About £20 a week.
Do you have any other source of income?
Oh, yes. Yes, I paint, mostly portraits, showing the aura of the subject in symbolic colours. I also own the lease of a fish and chip shop. It was left to me by a grateful client in her will. So with that, and with the money from my art and from my counselling, I have an income of, well, perhaps £100 a week.
And do you find that sufficient for your needs?
More than enough. Well, I only make a charge for consultations to discourage time wasters.
Now then, about Mrs. Penn. We've heard that she first visited you last April or May.
It was April the 14th.
Thank you. And she visited you regularly every Wednesday until September. How would you describe your relationship with her?
We were friends. No. More than friends, we were kindred spirits.
Yes. Did you encourage in her the idea that she should give away her money?
That idea was first suggested by the tarot. Well, once the cards had indicated the problem, it was the obvious solution. You see, Elizabeth could not focus her being because she was tied to the material plane. Oh, it was quite clear to me when I first asked her to make a sound, a musical sound. Do you know what sound she made? It was ah.
Now, why was that significant?
Because the sound ah represents earthly reality. Oh, I'd have been much happier if she'd made the sound ooh. Ooh. The sound of the psychic state. Ah, but by far the best. The sound mm. Mm. The symbol of the higher state of consciousness. The world of perfect stillness.
Now then, after you had read the tarot and come to this conclusion, you decided upon another occult experiment. Now, what was that?
I contacted the spirit of Arthur Penn, her late husband, and brought forth his message using the planchette.
Will you explain how this equipment is used?
It's very similar to a Ouija board. The sensitive places her fingers on the rim, and the spirit controls them and uses their unconscious movements to write its message. Oh, it can't be faked. I mean, I must emphasize that. I mean, if you put your fingers on the planchette and try to produce a written message, you'd end up with a hopeless squiggle. But by going into a trance and allowing the spirit to work through you, you can produce legible writing. You know, when the spirit of Arthur Penn first came through, the writing was very clear, very firm. I felt that here was a mind of immense force and direction.
Yes. Now, what was your experience? What did you feel while this was going on?
Oh, my usual experience on these occasions. Well, I feel detached from my own body as though I were a third person in the room. Oh, I can see and hear what's going on, but I can't control it unless I make an act of will to return into my body and come out of the trance. But meanwhile, my body is being used by the spirit. Sometimes it speaks through my voice. Sometimes it writes its messages through my fingers. And sometimes it just plants thoughts or emotions in my mind that I know have come from elsewhere, from beyond.
Now, we've heard from Mrs. Penn that her husband's spirit message asked her to use the money for the furtherance of the occult, but she said that it was your suggestion that she should give the money to you. Is that true?
It arose out of a long discussion. Well, as you say, we were quite clear about the spirit message. She knew she wanted to give her money away, and she knew it had to go in some way to help the secret arts. Well, she asked me. She said, "What would you do, madame?" And I said, "Oh, Elizabeth, I would found an institute. I would make it a place of occult learning for students of the occult from all over the world, a sort of university of the secret arts. That's how I would use the money." But you know, the idea appealed to her enormously. She insisted that I should take the money and try and turn this dream into a reality. Now, we talked about how it could be done, how I could sell my house and she could sell hers, and we could pool our resources and buy premises to bring teachers and students of the occult together to share their wisdom and psychic gifts. It would be a great venture, a worthy venture. We were both fired with enthusiasm, and I felt the warm approval of Arthur's spirit, too, that his money should be used in that way. We were both, I suppose you could say, we were both drunk with the excitement, with the grandeur of the vision. And she insisted. I didn't ask. I swear I didn't even as much as hint. She insisted on writing a check for all she had in the bank, and she presented it to me. And I was overwhelmed. But I felt myself strengthened in my resolution by her confidence in me. Any doubts I might have had about my ability to achieve that great thing were dissolved by that gesture of faith. I was close to tears. Well, I think we were both deeply moved.
Now then, the following day, you paid the check into your account, and that evening you received another visit from Mrs. Penn. Will you tell us what happened then?
She was in a state of distress. I realized she'd been got at. put it bluntly. I mean, her bank manager had been on at her, and her son interfered as well. Well, I explained to her. I should have explained before. The road to secret wisdom is a difficult one. Partly because of the blindness and the prejudice of the unenlightened, but you have to ignore them, even fight against them. And I told her, well, again, it was obvious that her son was driven by greed. And I argued. Well, I reasoned with her. But I emphasized one thing above all, that it was the spirit of her husband that insisted that she make this gift. If she took the money back, she defied not me, but him. Well, I'm not a cowardly woman. But I would think twice before I went against the wishes, the instructions of a spirit of the second sphere.
Did you say that to defy the spirits would be to risk death?
Yes.
And why did you say that?
Because it's true.
Now, Detective Sergeant Cottrell has told the court that when he arrested you, you said, if the silly old bat wants to give me her money, it's her business. Now, did you say that?
I don't remember saying anything like that. Well, I was angry, I know. I might have said something, that she was a silly old woman. I don't know, but the way he made it sound, oh, no.
Now, let me ask you now about the so-called investigation by the private detective, Mr. Winder. First of all, he says that you charged him £10 for a consultation. That's twice as much as you charged Mrs. Penn.
Oh, yes. Well, I do that, you see. If I don't like the look of a client, I ask for a lot of money, and it usually puts them off. Or if it doesn't put them off, at least it compensates me for putting up with them, you know. I wasn't fooled by him. Oh, no. Not for a moment. I mean, all those lies about his wife having died and all that, I knew he was making it up. Well, I thought, well, Mr. Williams, just let's see what this is all about. So I played it straight. I told him his wife was an earthbound spirit, which was true enough, and I said, we must go back to the place where she died. Well, that shook him. And he started gabbling, all this rigmarole about how he'd moved and the house had been pulled down, and, well, it was all I could do to keep a straight face. And then he took me to this car park and he said, this was the place. Well, I thought, just let's see how far you're prepared to go with this charade. How about £500? And that cooled him off straight away. You see, I couldn't understand why he was lying to me. And then I realized, well, I caught a flash from his subconscious. I can do that sometimes. I realized he was in league with my enemy, Harold Penn. Then it made sense.
Why didn't you accuse him of lying to you, Madame Bronski?
Well, I knew it wasn't the time or the place. That it was just part of a greater destiny that was working itself out. And so it has proved. Well, my presence here in this court is the culmination of a period of testing and preparation that I've been going through for many years. And the outcome of this trial is fated too. I mean, it will prove my claims to a skeptical world. It will advance the cause of the occult sciences more than anything else could do. We're all part of the plan.
You are assuming that you will be acquitted, of course.
Well, of course.
Thank you.
The case of the Queen against Barnes, alias Bronski, will be concluded tomorrow in the Crown Court. The case you're about to see is fictitious, but the procedure is authentic. The characters are played by actors, but the jury is selected from members of the general public. Mrs. Vera Barnes, alias Madame Veda Bronski, claims to be a clairvoyant and to be able to contact the spirits of the dead. She's charged with dishonestly obtaining £17,500 by deception. The money was given to her by a former client, Mrs. Elizabeth Penn. She's pleaded not guilty.
Madame Bronski, your real name is Vera Barnes. Why did you change it?
My name is Veda Bronski. In my last incarnation, I was sister to Grigory Efimovich, who was better known as the monk Rasputin. Now, when I discovered that, I changed my name. But it is interesting, isn't it, that in this incarnation I should have been given the same initials and a very similar Christian name.
Is there any historical evidence that Rasputin had a sister called Veda?
My lord, with regret, I was not expecting to be asked about 19th century Russian history.
I have my information direct from the spirit of my late brother, but I'm sure it could be confirmed if you wanted to look it up.
I don't suppose it matters.
I would suggest to you that you changed your name because Madame Veda Bronski sounds a grander and more mysterious name than Mrs. Vera Barnes, and would therefore be better for business.
Well, you may believe what you choose to believe, but I can call myself by any name I please. Well, if I'd wanted to take a name from an early incarnation, I might have been the Marquise Annette Duverne, or even Demetria, High Priestess of Artemis.
What was your maiden name?
In my present incarnation?
On your birth certificate.
Harbottle.
You are, by profession, if that's the word, a clairvoyant. Do you have any qualifications? Have you, for example, studied the subject at a university? Or do you have a certificate of competence in the occult?
I've been tested by professional researchers.
I'll be calling evidence on this point, my lord.
Madam Bronski, I simply ask, do you have a degree or any other professional qualification?
My lord, my learned friend knows full well that it is not customary for academic institutions to offer courses in this area of study.
With respect to my learned friend, several universities in the United States of America, and no doubt elsewhere in the world, offer tuition in precisely this area. I ask you again, Madame Bronski, do you have professional qualifications as a clairvoyant?
I do not need pieces of paper. I have traveled to the fourth circle of the astral universe. I have spoken with the spirits of Eliphas Levi and Madame Blavatsky. I have penetrated the secrets of the pyramids and the lost races of Atlantis and Mu.
In short, the answer is no. Your main source of income, I think you said, is the lease on a fish and chip shop, which was bequeathed to you by one of your clients, yes?
Yes.
Yes, so even before you hit upon the unfortunate Mrs. Penn, you had already managed to turn your talents to considerable financial advantage.
My lord, I really must object. The implication is that my client somehow engineered this bequest.
Yes, perhaps we'll move on to matters of more immediate concern, Mr. Percival.
My lord, let me ask you this, Madame Bronski. When Mrs. Penn first came to you, she had only recently lost her husband. You said yourself that she was subservient to him. Perhaps you would agree that she was in a very vulnerable state at the time.
Oh, yes, I would agree to that.
Yes. In fact, she was lonely, yes?
Yes.
Confused, unstable, easily led.
Oh, yes.
And you took advantage of that, didn't you?
I did not. I helped her. I encouraged her to take charge of her own destiny. I told her, if you will it, it can be. You can become whatever you want to become.
Was that why you called her a silly old bat?
I'm sure I never said that.
Oh, really? In order to become a psychic person, if that is what you are, is it necessary to have no money?
Well, it depends. It depends on how much you're held back by an attachment to material things.
Yes, but you're hardly penniless, are you, Madame Bronski? At least not since last September. And you live a very highly coloured existence on the astral plane.
Well, I never cared about money. I mean, money means nothing to me.
No, so you can be psychic and rich, but if Mrs. Penn wants to be psychic, she has to be poor. Forgive me if I find that rather inconsistent.
Elizabeth was worried about her money. If your money worries you, you should give it away and turn your mind to things that really matter. It's not only I that say this. Jesus of Nazareth said the same.
But it was not the Bible that persuaded Mrs. Penn on this point, was it? It was your so-called spirit writing. This rather weird-looking implement of yours. May I have a look at it? Exhibit 2. What's it called? Forgive my ignorance. A planchette. Yes. Now then, you put your pencil through here, so it's... And then your finger's on the rim and it moves about of its own accord, is that right?
Yes, only you're pushing it, you see. When the spirit moves it, it's quite different.
Oh, well, let's see. What was the spirit message? AP. The initials AP. Arthur Penn. Well, it's a bit shaky, but no doubt it'll improve with practice.
That's not spirit writing. It is quite different.
Oh, really? Did you keep your piece of paper so that we may compare the two?
No, I didn't.
Ah, so much for the planchette.
Oh, no, just a moment. You're trying to say I faked the whole thing.
Thank you, Madame Bronski. I'd like to move on
No,
now,
I
if I
want
may.
to answer this charge. I in no
You
way...
are required only to answer the questions that are put to you. You must not make a statement except in answer to a question.
I am not a fake.
When Mr. Winder, the private detective, consulted you about his wife, you did fake the trance. You've told us yourself that you faked it.
I did not say that.
One moment, please. You told my colleague. I was not fooled by him. All those lies about his wife having died, I knew he was making it up, so I played it straight. I told him his wife was an earthbound spirit. In other words, you played out a charade for his benefit, yes?
I played out a charade, yes, but even so, I genuinely went into a trance. And I searched the lower levels for the vibrations that would confirm his story. Naturally, I found nothing there, and that's when I knew he was lying.
Oh, you know, your whole account of your dealings with Mr. Winder is palpably false. You were taken in by him, you did believe his story, and you played out a charade for his benefit, because that's what you always do. Never mind. Let's get back to Mrs. Penn. She had decided to donate her money to the cause of the occult. Very well, what happened next? Did you perhaps discuss with her the many respected and official organizations to which she might contribute, to the Society for Psychical Research, perhaps? Or did you perhaps suggest that she might make a grant to a university for the study of the occult? No, you did not. You said to her, Mrs. Penn, I think you should give your money to me.
Oh, that's not how it happened. As I've said, it arose out of a long discussion. And anyway, why should I not be the best person to use her money the way she wanted? To finance a genuine international institute for the occult. Well, it's not the sort of thing you can rush into. I wanted to wait for a propitious moment to launch this venture. I wanted to fast and to pray and to seek the guidance of the powers and to prepare myself in other ways.
Well, you were in no hurry, so why did you need a cheque that very evening?
It didn't have to be that evening. But Elizabeth wanted to make the symbolic gesture of writing the cheque there and then and giving it to me. I took it to please her. Well, to have rejected it would have been to spoil the moment.
There was no waiting for a propitious moment about that transaction, was there? I suppose it came as no surprise to you when, later that same day, you had another visit from Mrs. Penn, who told you that she had indeed changed her mind.
Not changed her mind. Had it changed for her?
She asked for her money back and you refused. In fact, you threatened her, didn't you?
I certainly did not.
Didn't you tell her that if she went back on the arrangement, the spirits would be angry? Didn't you say that if the spirits were angry, they would make her suffer, perhaps even cause her death?
I said nothing at all like that. I told her it was unwise to act against the advice of her husband's spirit, certainly. Then she got very agitated and she asked me what would happen if she did that. And I told her, as I know it to be true, that in cases where people have defied the powers, those people have suffered and some of them have died. That is a fact.
It did the trick, though, didn't it? It scared her off and you kept the money. Madame Bronski, you didn't want that money to start any institute. That was simply part of your confidence trick. The simple truth is that you wanted a lot of money, and you wanted it quickly for a quite different reason.
My lord, my learned friend is touching here upon matters that are not pertinent to the case and may be prejudicial to my client.
What have you to say to that, Miss Percival? Is that so?
No, my lord, it is highly pertinent. In fact, relates to her evidence in chief, in the course of which the witness made several statements which are not true. I shall confine my cross-examination to those statements.
Very well.
You told Miss Gibson that your income is about £100 a week. Yes?
That's right.
You said it was sufficient for your needs. You
Yes.
said, I don't need any more money.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's not true, is it?
Well, of course it's true. Who could need any more? I mean, I live alone. My needs are very few.
Well, isn't it true that you were, before you received this windfall from Mrs. Penn, quite heavily in debt?
My lord, really, we've heard no evidence on this point. It's quite improper for my learned friend to introduce such matters at this stage.
Not at all, Miss Gibson. Your client's financial state is a perfectly proper topic for cross-examination.
Thank you. Well, Madame Bronski, were you in debt?
I owe money. All right, everybody owes money. I mean, the grocery bill, the telephone bill, income tax. I owe a little here and there. But I own a house, don't forget. My house is security for my debts.
The house you were proposing to sell to finance your institute.
Money is not important to me. I don't worry about it. I never have. How can anyone who has traveled in the fourth dimension worry about things like that?
Thank you. I have no further questions.
You may return the defendant to the dock.
Are you Professor Hubert Loomis of Fulchester University?
As far as I know.
Is there some doubt about it?
Well, philosophically speaking, there might well be. However, I shan't quibble.
And where do you live, Professor?
Swan Cottage, Borford.
What is your field of study?
Biophysics, specifically the energy fields generated or modified by living organisms.
I see. Now, do you know the defendant, Madame Bronski?
Oh, yes.
So, will you tell the court how you first encountered her?
Yes, certainly. She wrote to me some 2 years ago at the university in answer to an advertisement which I placed in the Psychic News. It was an open invitation, really, to anyone who considered him or herself to be psychic or clairvoyant, to use those very imprecise terms, to participate in a series of experiments. Madame Bronski was one of 5 people who responded to the advertisement.
Yeah, what was the aim of these experiments, Professor?
The hypothesis was this, that those people who lay claim to psychic or clairvoyant powers are, one considers specifically telepathy, psychokinesis or faith healing, are, insofar as their claim may be justified, either reacting to or generating a biological energy field, what is sometimes called the psychomagnetic field. It's an attractive hypothesis.
Miss Gibson, fascinating as this may be to those who understand it, will you direct the witness to the facts of the case?
My lord, I'm trying to establish that Madame Bronski's claims about clairvoyancy and spiritualism are indeed taken seriously by such reputable scientists as Professor Loomis.
No doubt. May we now have some evidence on the point?
Yes, my lord. Will you tell us, as briefly as you can, about the experiment that you did with Madame Bronski?
I set up an experiment to test the claim, which is often made by clairvoyants, that by handling an object which has been in the possession of a particular person, the clairvoyant can discover certain facts about that person. I took 12 of my students. Each of them put a particular personal possession, a penknife, cigarette lighter, a ring, so on, into a bag. I then took that bag through into the other room and asked Madame Bronski to take out each article in turn and to describe its owner, basing her impression, of course, only on what she could learn from the object. I wrote down the descriptions, took them back to the students, and asked them to sort out among themselves which description fitted which student. Now, by comparing that matching with the true pairing, I was able to arrive at a statistical measure of how well or badly Madame Bronski had performed.
Yeah, and the result?
Over a series of 10 trials, the number of hits, that's to say correct guesses, was over 5 times chance expectation.
Yes, how did she compare with other psychics you tested?
Oh, she was by far the best. 2 of the others achieved significant results, but Madame was outstanding.
Excuse me, before you go on, what do you mean by chance expectation?
The expected number of accurate guesses when the individual is working entirely at random. The odds against a hit on any individual attempt are 11 to 1 against.
So 5 times would be 50 correct guesses.
That's right.
In other words, she was wrong more often than she was right.
Oh, well, yes, but the odds against such a result happening by chance are astronomical.
I see. Carry on.
Yeah, what was the next stage of your experiment, Professor?
We ran a series of similar tests, but this time introducing various factors which might be expected to make it more difficult for the subject. Now, for example, we used 12 identical little tin boxes which could be told apart only by a number inside the lid of each box. Madame was asked to match each box to the student who'd been carrying it in his pocket all morning. Again, over the series she scored significantly above chance. But what was perhaps more interesting, for this series we wired her and the other subjects to an electroencephalograph. Now, using this equipment, we were able to measure the electrical activity of her brain while she was handling the objects. And the results were quite extraordinary. As she began to concentrate, the wave pattern showed the usual combination of detachment and excitement. It's a recognized pattern. And then we recorded a surge of electrical activity across a wide part of the cortex, about 20 microvolts. And immediately after that, the most remarkable thing. Nothing at all for the space of 3 or 4 seconds. It's unprecedented.
Well, how would you explain this interruption of the brain's electrical activity?
Well, my own inclination is to the view that in some way Madame Bronski was, by psychokinetic power, interrupting the usual operation of the equipment. There have been cases in the past where psychics have had a curious effect on electrical equipment placed near them, cameras, tape recorders, wireless, and so on. But against that, one has to set Madame Bronski's own explanation of the effect. She said that she had, as she put it, left the body and entered the astral plane. Now, to her, the period had seemed much longer than a mere couple of seconds, but since she also points out that the astral plane exists outside normal space and time, that also makes a strange kind of sense.
Did you proceed to further experiments?
Unfortunately not.
Why not?
There was disagreement in the department about the usefulness of the experiment. Well, money to pay for them was limited. We came to the end of our allocation and it was not renewed. I am hopeful of reversing the decision and resuming the experiments before too long.
In your expert opinion, Professor, do the facts support Madame Bronski's claims that she is a genuine psychic?
I cannot answer that question with a simple yes or no. But I can say that, insofar as I have been able to measure the ability which she calls clairvoyance, it is genuine, consistent, and at the moment quite mysterious.
Thank you.
Professor Loomis, I'm sure you know a great deal about biophysics. How much do you know about conjuring tricks?
Very little. These were not conjuring tricks.
Did you, in setting up these experiments, ask the advice of a professional magician?
No.
I see. Why did you change the system after the first series?
Well, as I explained, to make it more difficult for the subject.
To make it harder to cheat?
If you like, yes.
So it was possible for Madame Bronski to cheat on the first series?
It would have been very difficult. But I wanted to eliminate any possibility of unconscious clues, or that the effect could be achieved by telepathy, as opposed to true clairvoyance. You see, if I was presenting the objects to Madame Bronski and I knew who owned each object, well, she had only to read my mind.
So you admit the first series of experiments were badly designed?
It was capable of improvement, so I improved them.
Yes, and did she do equally as well in the second series?
Almost as well.
Yes, but did she do equally or better, yes or no?
No.
How much of a sensation did these results of yours cause in the scientific world?
They haven't been published yet.
Oh, why not?
Well, I haven't been able to complete my experiments. I should want to be absolutely certain of my results.
You mean at the moment you're uncertain?
Well, I should want to run sequences of several thousand hits or misses rather than a mere couple of hundred. You see, the more you do, the more certain it becomes that any deviation from chance expectation is significant.
Yes, but so far you're not sure enough of your results to publish them.
No.
And meanwhile your grant has been withdrawn because your colleagues thought you were wasting time and money.
Well, it was a matter of priorities in the allocation of resources. There is prejudice in the academic world against the investigation of the paranormal, and a scientist who takes it seriously does run the risk of being called a crank. The fact that I have chosen to stake my reputation on this series of experiments is, I suppose, a measure of the importance that I attach to them.
And how has your reputation fared, Professor?
Not very well so far.
Just one final question, Professor Loomis. Is there a scientist in this country who knows more about the subject of clairvoyance than you do?
In all modesty, I doubt it.
Thank you.
And so, members of the jury, we have proved the 4 crucial facts which we set out to prove in this case. The first is not disputed. That on the 24th of September, Mrs. Penn gave to Madame Bronski the sum of £17,500. The second is the fact of her reason for making this gift. As Mrs. Penn told you, she did so because she believed that her late husband's spirit wanted her to do it. And that brings us to the third essential fact, the reason why Mrs. Penn had come to hold this bizarre opinion. She was persuaded of it by the performance with the so-called spirit writing on the part of Madame Bronski. The fourth fact is the most vital one, that Madame Bronski deliberately deceived her on this point. She told Mrs. Penn a pack of lies, which she knew were lies. Of course, Madame Bronski is a very persuasive woman, who has tried to persuade all of us that she at least believes all this nonsense about spirits and vibrations and so on. But the law takes account of that. If Madame Bronski presented as fact statements which she knew were at best unverifiable, uncertain, mere guesses and possibilities, then she is guilty of false pretenses. Whatever tricks Madame Bronski may have been able to do with tin boxes and brainwave machines, on that one crucial occasion, at least, she was a fraud. Again, if Madame Bronski pretended that she was going to buy a big house and start an institute for the occult, and that was not true, then that was a false pretense. She defrauded a gullible widow of her life savings. That is the inescapable conclusion if you accept these 4 simple facts. Your verdict must be guilty.
Members of the jury, you don't have to believe in spiritualism to find my client not guilty, although I hope that after hearing from Professor Loomis, you're keeping an open mind. No, all you have to accept, and I think it's glaringly obvious, is that Madame Bronski herself believes in spiritualism, believes in the astral plane, and is convinced that when she goes into one of her trances, she does indeed communicate with the dead. Now, spiritualism is not as an eccentric a belief as you might suppose. A good many famous people have subscribed to it. Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Edison, the writer Conan Doyle. And to these names, we must add that of Elizabeth Penn, an ardent convert to the beliefs of Madame Bronski, who one evening decided to support her friend's plans for an institute of the occult and stumped up some money towards it. It was a private financial arrangement between 2 fellow believers. And then a whole series of people decided to interfere in it. Mr. Weems, bank manager. Harold Penn, the son. And let's not forget its sole heir. Mr. John Winder, private detective, although what his evidence has to do with it, heaven alone knows. And finally, the awesome machinery of the criminal law. Now, members of the jury, do you really believe that Madame Bronski is a criminal, a thief? Or is she perhaps a woman of possibly eccentric beliefs who had a dream, a burning ambition, and whose friend decided to share it with her? There's an ancient principle of the law, volente non fit injuria, and that, roughly translated, means if the victim is willing, then there is no crime. Well, this being the case, it is your duty to find my client not guilty.
I remind you that you must first decide whether the accused acted dishonestly. That means whether she said things that were untrue and which she knew were or might be untrue in order to get money from Mrs. Penn. Now, it's not enough to decide that what she said was untrue, or even that any reasonable person would have known that it was untrue. You must be sure that she herself said it was true when she herself knew that it was either untrue or uncertain. You must be sure, secondly, that it was because of this deception, this false pretense, that the money was paid. Only if you're sure on those points will you find the defendant guilty. Now, will you please retire, appoint a foreman to speak for you, and consider your verdict.
All stand. Will the foreman please rise? Please answer this question, yes or no. Are you agreed upon your verdict?
Yes.
Do you find the defendant, Mrs. Veda Bronski, guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Vera Barnes, stand up, will you? The offence you committed is a very serious one. You took advantage of a person in a particularly vulnerable state following a bereavement. Were it not for your previous good character, the sentence of this court would be an extremely severe one. However, I am bound to take that into account, and the fact that your counsel has undertaken that the money will be returned. The sentence of this court is a term of imprisonment for 18 months, suspended for 2 years.